Hello everybody, welcome back. This is week number 2 for ASP.NET 2, and we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We managed to get through the syllabus last time, introductions, talk about Visual Studio a little bit, and then cover the beginning parts of Chapter 1. My goal here right now, as I just told the class, was to finish off the quick little lecture bits here in Chapter 1, and then move on to building a sample application that we can kind of use as a basis for understanding where we're going to be going with this and what the capabilities are for this product. There's no real heavy programming or anything in this particular chapter. It's really more just kind of following some examples. So why don't we go ahead and get started here. All right, so if I remember right, this is about where we left off. I remember that heading, and I think maybe even right in that position that we were in last time, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong. But they're talking about MVC 5 and how there's been various versions of ASP, and I think that maybe we might even have gotten past that, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong. All right, no, I don't think so. All right, here we go. So the interesting thing is, and I think we did talk about it a little bit last time, how the concept for MVC actually kind of predates the modern era by, decades, where the original kind of sparks for this kind of happened in the late 70s. And I always think about programmers in that area when they were basically just working with console programs and punch cards and stuff like that, that they would have the wherewithal to even think about these structures or theories for doing programming. As far as ASP.NET as a technology is concerned, the core technology, I always have to remember this, we really don't teach the core technology much. I think in the first course, maybe in chapter 1 or 2, there's a little thing where you convert the time to a string and then you put it on the page. And that's the only piece of traditional ASP scripting that was in that course. ASP is a scripting language like PHP is, meant to be embedded into HTML documents. So you process your HTML, you're putting stuff on the screen, you run a little bit of code to do some sort of logic or math or something, and then you continue on with your HTML. That's how ASP works, very much like PHP. While that approach can still work, and there were a lot of websites built that way. In fact, I always tell people, one of the more significant websites that you might use, and I'm not going to say on a daily basis, but maybe often, if you're in the web program at least, is W3 School. So have you guys ever go to that site? Yep. Right. And if you go into that site, and I know that they have ASP stuff here, so you see that. So they have traditional ASP, and notice that ASP and ASP.NET. And then this isn't a bad place to go. If you really want to learn the legacy technologies, you can come here and work on it. What we did in the first class, the stuff that we focused on was web forms and web pages, right? So that should sound kind of familiar, right? Like you drag a button onto your page or something like that. So that's like a web form. Or if you're just creating regular web pages. We're working on the MVC piece, but then if you notice, the very top one is the classic ASP. So I always like to show students just a little bit of that, just so you kind of get an idea of what it's like. So here's just a little snippet of code, for example, and I'll give it a couple clicks of zoom here to help us out in seeing it. The big takeaway from this really is they have their own language that really ties in very closely to the whole Visual Studio construct. So if you're learning VB, switching to ASP.NET's really not that far off. Of course, they come up with, every language comes up with their own keywords to try to do this, print or echo or whatever statement or language you're learning. The important takeaway with ASP stuff is that it was embedded into HTML, like I mentioned, and then when you were switching to ASP code, they used their own ASP style delimiters. In fact, ASP is the language that came up with the bracket % do your code, % bracket to close. And then when, kind of mimicking what PHP was doing, and what do they use in PHP to do the same thing? You guys remember? Yeah, question mark PHP and then question mark at the end. Yeah, and it doesn't matter. Really all it's doing is it's telling the engine that's parsing the document that you got programming code here, right? And it's not code that's native to HTML. You have to do the same thing with JavaScript too. If you think about it that way, you have to put script tags around it if you drop it into your HTML. So it's not that it's a completely dead language, because there are sites that are still supported by it. And I just want to point you out to one that's pretty significant. And if you look right up here in the title of this, or the address bar of this document, what's the file extension? .asp. So I don't know exactly how they're coding these pages, because here's what happens, right? Whenever you use a server-side language, and I do the right-click view source, none of the ASP code is going to show, right? None of the server-side code, just the output of it. And whether or not they're actually using ASP to generate the page, we don't really even know, because you can drop the tag or the file extension on any file, throw HTML into it, and it'll still work. PHP is the same way. The only difference is when you add that file extension, the server knows to process it, to look to process server-side code. So they might have some things in there. I'm not really quite sure quite yet what it is on their site that does that, because I don't get to look at the back-end code, but I think it's fascinating. The other thing that's important here is you do have like one reliable source where you can go for input and information on this stuff. And you'll also learn that even though, yes, it is a very Microsoft-centric technology, it is possible to actually use other tools to do the work. But ultimately, to drive ASP.NET content, you have to run on a Windows server or a heavily modded Linux server, which is not recommended. It just really doesn't work well, frankly. Okay, let's go back to the PDF here. All right, so the ASP scripting language kind of preceded MVC1 in the architecture. So ASP as a scripting language, I want to say was like kind of late to mid 90s kind of scripting language. I think that's when it started hitting. And they didn't apply any of, first of all, the .NET stuff to the platform until roughly the turn of the millennium, so right around the year 2000 sometime. And you can Google this and figure it out with specific dates. But right around that time is when they moved it to the .NET platform. Remember, when you add that .NET to any of the Microsoft technologies, really all you're saying is when you're compiling the code at runtime, when it turns into bytecode, it all goes through what they call a CLR, the Common Language Runtime. So anything you code in Visual Studio on a Microsoft platform and you compile or run it, it all goes through the same engine. It doesn't matter what language you start with, that's the engine that pushes out the code that actually talks to the CPU. Or in this case, more often, to the abstraction layer that sits above Windows. Okay? So that's all that .NET means. The MVC part of it, this architecture that we talked about a little bit last week, was introduced in 2007. So it's really a pretty new technology. We're talking a dozen years old for ASP.NET. And very quickly, you can see from the dates, so 2007, 2010, and no coincidence on these dates either. This was about the release point, a little after this was the release point of Windows 7. 2010 was the release date of Windows 8, 2012 was 8.1, and you're going to see those dates kind of being mimicked here. In terms of like the kind of stuff that you could do, they detail it here. And you know what? As with any technology, they ramp it up over time. They find new things to do, follow what others are doing with the same technology. But some of the more significant steps, I think, happened when they got to the version 3, and actually more significantly version, I think it's 3.5. I don't know if they have a separate, no, they just go right to 4. But those versions were pretty significant because the big thing that happened with the MVC3 version is this thing, right? Which, like, if you're a student, you just kind of, oh, raise your view, next, you just kind of skip over it. But that tool was really huge because what it allowed us to do is simplify the code embedded into the pages for output so that the output code looked a lot cleaner and a lot easier to manage, basically. So when you look at something like this. This is a traditional ASP.NET tag, like what we use in the first course, right? You create content areas and you push your content into it. With Razor, this thing would happen. So we're looking at an old version of code right now, and here's kind of the takeaway, so you understand just a brief intro to Razor. In the old days, if we wanted to write with traditional ASP code a loop and drop it into our HTML for output, we would have to do like what we do in PHP. We write some code, right? And then when we have to switch back to HTML, we have to escape out. So that's right at the end of the for each line, right here. I guess I shouldn't use my finger. I should use the pointer for those watching the recording. I always forget that. And then you throw in your HTML, and then inside you want to put in some dynamic code again. So there's your ASP tag again, and you do some stuff. And then you got to escape out, and you got to close your HTML stuff. And it's like this really cumbersome process of like inserting one type of code into another. And of course, if you don't have a good IDE, fortunately we have the Visual Studio, but if you don't have a good IDE, it's so easy to miss a bracket or a percent sign, or where's that double quote belong, you know, that whole scenario. And I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. So what they did is they came up with this Razor view engine, and look at the difference in what happens here. First of all, instead of like the ASP tag, you're going to see a Razor tag. So you're going to see this @ sign listed, and then certain like keywords that work just with Razor. But then when you go down to that same loop, look at the difference in the cleanliness of the code, and because of that, easier to basically create it and not screw up, in my mind. So anytime we were doing you know, ASP output using programming code, we flip into Razor mode with the @ sign, drop in our stuff, and then we just kind of carry on, right? We use our curly bracket the way we're supposed to. We don't have to escape out. The engine knows what's going on. Switch to HTML, drop in some more Razor, and it's very, very clean, a lot easier to read. That's what was a huge step forward. And because that was a big thing that happened in version 3 for ASP.NET, that's when it really kicked in for Microsoft and really kind of became a big thing, because all of a sudden it was kind of easy to do. So that propelled a lot of programmers to use it. All right, MVC4 came out. Did he put a date on this one? I didn't see a date. I mean, yeah, I'm not really seeing it. And then when they were starting to work at this point, so you got it like it's probably around 2012, 2013 at this point is my guess. This new development was happening, and you see this key phrase, web API. It's a very important web technology, and what it is, it's an API that's built into the HTML standard that allows you to do a lot of stuff that in the past was just impossible. So a lot of little things, and you may have learned about them in web programming too, to some degree, but we'll reinforce some of those things here. Important development here is basically the fact that HTML5 at this point was under development. It wasn't really a standard, it was still being developed, but the web API was a huge component of it. By the time it did become a standard, the web API was completely incorporated into HTML5 and allows for a lot of the functionalities that in the past we could only leverage with JavaScript, for example. So like if you wanted to do validation on a form, prior to web API, you basically had to code in JavaScript or some other server-side language or both. When this was introduced and then bundled with HTML5, we can just put like a required listing on a HTML form field and it validates. So it kind of made things easy. And that's just one of the things that technology can do. But the thing that was kind of interesting about the web API as well is whoever put that together also was really wise, like the people who were back in the late 70s, about getting like MVC type tools built into the architecture so we can leverage it into the future, and it has been very successful. So we could do routing, we could bind to models. Notice the validation piece, right, that I was talking about. But that one is actually a little bit higher level one in that when we're binding to some data, we also have the ability to validate it so that it goes in clean to the structure we're working with. Filters were added. That's something we're going to learn in just a few weeks. And then this really huge step forward for a lot of technologies like this. In MVC, when you create what we call a code-first approach to data, so we create code that describes a database table, for example. Instead of making the database table, the code does it for us. And then scaffolding is this tool that's built into most MVC software packages so that, let's say we write some code to create a table. The engine will ask you a bunch of questions, and depending on how you answer them, it's all a little series of checkboxes. It can go ahead and create not only the table, but an interface so that you can read and write to that table and edit it in the aftermath. And that is a very complex task. So can you imagine like coding that out all by yourself? Or with scaffolding, you just declare your model, you attach to it, tell it what stuff you want available, hit the button, you got like all these pages, and they're all built. So now all you need is like the logic to make the application go. So that's what scaffolding brings in. Huge importance in this thing. All right. Moving on. They go through a little bit of a breakdown here. Now the interesting thing is, at this point, our book is written around MVC 5. Okay? There is an MVC 6 already out, and I know we can get to it through Visual Studio. I'm not sure where they're at with MVC 7. I haven't read up on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's really, really soon too. I don't know what they're adding to it. I don't anticipate any revolutionary changes. Usually they're just adding, improvements and some components. But it's hard to say without knowing what the specs are. Another thing that's kind of fun too about these technologies is this thing, the bundling and minification. Does anybody know what minification means? Have you ever seen that term?
Yeah, with jQuery.
With jQuery, right?
It's all compressed, no spaces, no.
Exactly. So like the jQuery library, if you're like writing the code, you indent it, and you leave spaces, and you put comments in, and you use verbose variable names and function names so that you know as a programmer what's going on. Whenever you take a bunch of code and minify it, you are stripping it down to its bare essentials, naming variables with maybe a letter or two, no descriptions, all the white spaces removed. And why? Because when you're loading up jQuery, which is maybe 10,000 lines, but you can condense it down to 2. Well, of course, they're really long ones, but you're making it a lot less for the computer to read. And when you're putting stuff online, that's all part of making it run faster. The problem with a lot of modern app development is when people are making websites and apps online, sometimes you'll go to a site, and granted they have to monetize things so they can make money. Sometimes they'll have calls to so many external JavaScript files. You're waiting like 30 seconds even on a really fast connection for all that stuff to load. It's got to load, it's got to process it, sometimes it has to pre-process. So it's all in an effort to make it run faster. The other thing that's kind of interesting too is a lot of it is really kind of considered kind of like standard. So like jQuery, very often when we create some of these things automatically, jQuery's added in, Bootstrap's added in. I think we talked about that last time. Why? Because that's pretty much what people do, so why not just include it, right? We don't have to like take 5 extra steps to do the install and the download and link it all up. We just drop it in and have it go. The other thing that was really big is they actually started releasing the technology to open source. There are some IDEs that I hear work pretty well with it. I've never used them, so I can't really vouch for them. I've always just kind of stuck with Visual Studio because it's just kind of like the de facto tool. It's like why drive a Toyota when you can drive a Mercedes, basically. It's kind of the way I look at it. Not that a Toyota is a bad car. I'm not saying that.
Options.
Yeah, exactly. All right. They have a lot of other stuff that they've been kind of adding in. One big thing, and we're going to experience it tonight, is the fact that they have the identity system built in. And basically what this means is, in the past, if I wanted to write a website that had authentication for users, I either would have had to have hand-coded it, bought into somebody's maybe expensive API, or something that was equally as expensive or cumbersome. What they've done now is Microsoft has built for the web, basically, the web part of it, the same kind of authentication engines they've been using for their major applications for a long time. So with a couple clicks of a button, you have robust authentication with like user registration, login, logout, password changing, email notifications. You don't have to do a darn thing except click a checkbox and say okay. So it's a wonderful thing. So take that into consideration too. The other big thing, we talked about this last time, is the fact that Bootstrap is now considered fairly standard in a lot of these web applications, and not only in this authoring engine, but in many others. And if you're not familiar with seeing something that's created with Bootstrap, what we're seeing on the screen right now, this example, is actually a pretty decent version of like what you might create. There's a certain font that they use and a certain layout that they use. And when you know all the little codes that go with it, it allows you to really pretty rapidly create a responsive application that works in just about any browser and has a minimum level of like looks good without any effort. Now, I mean, for my money, I'm often kind of resistant to using Bootstrap because that's not where I came from. I'm always more of a fan of kind of creating my own look. But granted, if I was creating something that doesn't really need to be all that special, and really I just maybe change a few things, this look that you see here, you may have seen it on many websites already, right? And there's many application developers that really don't worry about the look so much, because this is pretty good. I'll just drop my image and my logo in, change a couple things, and okay, I'm good. And that's kind of lazy, but at the same time, it's not bad. And the reason it's not bad is because people are used to finding things in certain spots. So when I come here, I expect the logo to be top left, my menu to be across the top, place to register and log in. People usually have some sort of rotator, slider, or big banner thing, maybe some columns. And then when you go to the subsequent pages, you get kind of standard looks too. And I don't know if they have any of those here, but it doesn't look like they do. All right. The other thing that is kind of interesting, so we talked about scaffolding before, is this thing called attribute routing. So when you guys have learned to develop pages in the past, you learned with HTML, even with PHP, that you would write a page, you put it in a folder, and then you call the machine, like the URL, and then after the slash, your folder and file structure, and you can get right to the file you want. That is not how MVC works. MVC's URL structure is designed to hotwire that. So in other words, to basically give you pretty looking URLs that are easy to negotiate, right? And have really nothing to do with the file and folder structure at all. Because here's our problem. With MVC, we're stitching pieces together. We're not really calling one file, we're kind of calling like 10. And those 10 are working together to give you that one page. So what you're doing through the URL structure is you're designating basically which method or controller you're triggering, right? And you'll figure out what those are soon. And then what parameters you're sending to it, or directives. So it's kind of like really like calling a method or a class or an object and throwing parameters at it. So it's kind of an interesting approach. So you'll see how that works when we get moving. Right? We talked about authentication. They have this thing called filters that we're going to be looking at too. We won't go too deep into that, but I think it's pretty interesting. All right, and then let's start talking about what it actually takes to do the work. Now, this is a dated book, all right? You know, last Windows operating system they have in there is 8. Since this book's come out, they have put out Windows 8.1 and Windows 10, and really there's like 5 versions or 6 versions of Windows 10 now. That, in my mind, are equal as importance as releases as these other things that you see here. The point is, if you're going to do anything MVC5, you can't be using an ancient computer. Even on those operating systems you're showing there, there's significant security issues. I would strongly shy away from all those OSs. Maybe Windows 7, I still use it a little bit at home, but like for file servers and print servers, I don't do anything critical on it. So, of course, there's been many server versions that have come since. Now, it might be kind of a weird thing, and Brenda, you're in the SharePoint class, so in that class, there is the possibility when you work on a Windows server that you can actually code directly in that environment. Not recommended, but you can. So that's why they list the server versions as well. And right now, the current Windows Server version that's coming out is 2019. 2012 is still huge in the marketplace. 2016 is, relatively big, but 2019 is the new one. And as far as installing it, really, since we're using Visual Studio, it kind of just does all that for us. When we did the install originally, and you select the certain tools you want to use, then it's really just a matter of like hitting the OK button, it downloads and installs everything, and it's there. There's a possibility that at some point in time, maybe you installed a piece of software that needed certain components, and it may have already been on your system. But for most people, those technologies are typically resident on the machine. All right, so the next thing we are going to do is we're going to start walking through this. And I know you guys may have started on it already. But I want to give you a little bit of a tidbit on this thing that we're about to work on a little bit. You're going to see that there's this URL here. And if you have the PDF or electronic version of the book, it should be linkable. So I'm going to pull that up on the screen. And I'm pulling it up so that you can see what this is. Now, in the old days of me teaching MVC in a .NET environment, we would go through and actually build this entire project. And this entire project does have I forget, it's like 100-page tutorial document that walks you through the entire build. But if you look at the technologies being used, look at the versions of MVC, right? And then I'm not sure where Entity Framework is now, but I know it's not at 4. It has really kind of progressed since then. However, I did find it a great project even when it started to get dated, because it really showed how Visual Studio worked. The problem is that the modern MVC that we will be using now structures its folders a little bit differently. So if I was to go through and teach you this MVC music store, it wouldn't match up with any of the other stuff that we'd be doing in class. In fact, if you're curious and you want to try to do a build on that, you could go to YouTube and just type my name and then MVC music store, and I actually have a complete set of videos out there stepping you through the whole project, start to finish. And I used to do that. Last time I think I taught it was when we had our SharePoint cohorts going out in Burlington, because we had the ample class time to do it, where we were able to do the whole darn thing. So, and it's kind of fun, frankly, and it still teaches you a lot about MVC. So if you're bored and want something to do, here you go. Have at it. It's free, and it's on YouTube, and it's me. So, for whatever that's worth. Okay, back to the book. All right, so we're going to go ahead and try doing this to get it going. Now, a couple disclaimers. Screenshots in this book I believe, are based on Visual Studio 2012. We in this class, most of us have installed Visual Studio 2019. Some of us have 2017 or 2015. 2017 and 2015 are pretty similar. 2019's got those different splash screens. And just to show you what I mean, I'm going to bring up the start page from Visual Studio 2019. Looks nothing like that screenshot, right? It's got this generic interface. But we are going to attempt, regardless, to get that going. Now, the one thing that I can do is I can just go ahead and create new project, right? And that seems pretty logical to me. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, because it should take me to the same place as the selection. Trying to kind of side-by-side it a little bit, as much as I can. And I'm going to scroll down here. Now, what they're going to want us to select is in Visual C#, under the web category, this selection here, which is ASP.NET Web Application. So we're going to try to find that exact thing. Now, notice that, oh, hey, it's right here. I've done that recently. That just happens to be the case. But however, if it's not popping up on your list like that, you can start to filter down. So right away we got C#, and then say, oh, ASP.NET Core Web Application. Notice how I emphasize the word core. Not the one you want, okay? That's the cross-platform development version, which does not have a lot of the features that we're looking for. They are actively working on it, so I wouldn't be surprised within a few years that maybe it will, and we can do this on any platform at all. So I'm going to switch to Windows, console, and then, oh, there it is. Okay, so it's the same one I have on the left already, but I want to show you how to get to it, just in case you don't have that listed in Visual Studio 2019. If you're using 2015, 2017, 2013, or 2012, any of those, your screens will look very much like these, if not exactly like these. Little minute differences, but basically that. They want us to give it a name, so once we make the selection, it's going to be called MVC Music Store. So let's go ahead, select it, and say next. All right. So different view here, but the same info really as the background. Okay, so the project name is going to be MVC Music Store. Now I'm going to add a little something to the end of it because I've done this a few times and I just don't want to conflict with my other versions. So I'm putting a little Fall 19 tag at the end of it. Also, notice where it plans to store not the project necessarily, but at least the solution file. And this is a change they made, I think, with the 2017 version that I'm not all too keen on. So in other words, they're separating solution files sometimes from the file structure of your program and putting it in your user directory inside of Windows, inside the source directory, inside repos. I'm not a fan. So what I'm going to do right off the bat is I'm going to change that. However you choose to work on your own equipment, that's up to you. But I would recommend that you have a folder structure that makes sense. To me, what they're doing doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I know that the other aspect of this is now a lot of people are starting to use source repositories that are online. So it makes sense for the solution file to be local and the repository to actually be out in the cloud somewhere. That's the thinking. So if you're working on GitHub instead of your local drive, your solution files and your repos, it just points out to GitHub. Here, I'm going to go actually find my .NET 2 folder. I'm going to make a new folder for class. I'm going to call it Fall 2019. I'm going to open that folder. And you know what? It's going to create another folder inside here, so I'm just going to select this folder. I'm not going to change the name of the solution, right? And I want you also to notice this checkbox, and this exists in all the different versions. So if you look here, well, not in that one, I suppose, but, oh no, I did. Right there it is. It's right above OK. Create directory for solution. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this selection or not, but when you're working on a project that might have multiple programs within it, this is something you probably want to uncheck. Because you might have your solution file one folder level above all the subprograms, but when you're just building one thing, I think it's okay to put the solution file in the same folder as the stuff that you're building. So I leave it checked, and the solution name kind of is drafted automatically. The .NET framework we're going to use, we're just going to leave that at default. There's no reason to change it. But if you were doing legacy work or trying to get in on work on specific equipment, you might come in here and scale that back. There are times when you kind of have to do that professionally, and hopefully you don't run into them often. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click Create, and that'll take us to the next screen. Now, in the document here, they make this little note, right? That from the menu, when you create these things, there isn't a template directly to an MVC structure, unless they've added it recently. But in the past, they've never had that, because once you create the ASP.NET application, that's, in the aftermath is when you select it. So to add those tools, and, and also to the degree to which you will add the tools. All right. So now they're saying that you have some particular things that you're going to have to start to select here. And notice the pretty big difference in the screens. Now in the past, I'm so used to looking at this old interface that we see right now, then I'm looking at this new one going, okay, I'm okay, I'm okay. You know, I'm trying not to like go into panic mode. But all the same options are there, they're just kind of in a little bit different fashion. So if you take a look and compare. What they would like us to do is select MVC. Okay, that's the template style. And then additionally, there's these check boxes where they allow you to pre-create some of the assets. In this case, they're checking the MVC box because they want to pre-create all the folders that you would normally put in every MVC project. And that typically will be models, views, and controllers at the very least. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and click that same box. The other thing that is actually new to 2019, notice how they have it configured for HTTPS. And I think we ran into this in the last course a little bit over the summer. So if you were with me in the summer taking this, the summer of 2019, we ran into this issue a little bit. And I forget, did we leave this checked?
We unchecked it this summer, but in the book it tells you to change the authentication, and once you add that, that gets grayed out.
Yeah, it removes it, exactly.
No, it leaves it, but it grays it out.
Yeah, because you don't have a choice.
Oh, right, yeah. I thought you meant
So what they're saying is, if you're capturing people's passwords, you have to encrypt the data. What happens if you don't?
Security breach.
Yeah, I mean, your information is basically going as plain text over the internet. So that's not acceptable. Scary thing is, like, 20 years ago or so, that's how most passwords were sent on the internet. No wonder they had so many hacks back then. It was like very, very insecure. All right, moving on. All right, so they talk about all the different templates here.
We were talking about something like add unit test.
Yes. Do you know what a unit test is? Did you guys do that in web programming too? You should have. No?
I assume it's just was for sort of testing, just like a place to sort of test the code, or just sort of like so you don't just bring it into users, you don't just have users testing it. You sort of create code for to test it.
Yes, that's exactly the concept. So like what you do is you write code that tests your code to make sure it behaves correctly without having to have like users do it for you. I mean, yeah, you could fire up the application and try it.
So what does it generate for you? Just a
Yeah, well, it actually has a whole series of, most of it is JavaScript-based functions that allow you to pass parameters to it, and then it pushes whatever you preset to your code to try to get an expected result, and then to see if it passes or fails. In web programming, too, if you took that class and used the Microsoft book we used to use, they would have you do all the work, and the first attempt was always a fail. And then they would teach you how to go back and fix it. And it was always frustrating for students. And I'm not sure how much you're really teaching it anymore.
We had a different book, it wasn't a Microsoft book. It was
Right,
someone-
yeah. You guys are using the single page application approach. Right. Which is a thing we're going to try in here a little bit too, just so we know. All right, I'm going to go ahead and change the authentication. Is that my mouse that's not working? Oh no, I had to click on the structure first,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so because it was grayed out here, I'm trying to click change for authentication. It just wasn't letting me do it. But I'm going to go ahead and click change. And now you see a screen that looks the same. Thank you, Microsoft, for making me comfortable. And they just want us to select individual user accounts. But please notice that you also have the ability to tap into both the Windows native authentication on, so if you're running something that runs on Windows, even though it's a web page, yes, you can do that. Or if you run in like a domained environment like we do here on campus if you're faculty or staff, and it can tap into a separate authentication server to log you in. This approach, the individual user accounts, actually creates its own internal database to store and maintain all of the passwords and a whole set of code that goes with it. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now, exactly like you said, Brenda, look what happened to the HTTPS. It becomes grayed out. I have to have it if I'm getting people's passwords, period. That's just all there is to it. You can't really tell, like I'm looking up on the projectors there, you can't tell that MVC is selected. Well, on this one I can, but not on the others. So it is selected. MVC is selected on that screen right where my mouse is. I'm going to go ahead and click create. And now it will take a little while, right? So it's not just creating a couple of folders and boom, you're set to go. I'm on a fairly quick machine, and this is probably a 20 to 30 second process. If you have an older machine with not a lot of RAM and probably not SSD, this might take a couple of minutes. So don't get impatient. Nothing is wrong. We are actually building an entire website here kind of automatically. And I think it's just such a cool thing considering what it would take in the past just to get this far. Yep, and even though it's like watching paint dry, I'm compelled to just let it run like this so you guys get like kind of like a baseline. So I would probably call my machine, average modern in capabilities, and this is how long it's taking. It is SSD, 16 gigs RAM, and an i7. So if you have something less than that, but not an SSD, you might be waiting. All right, maybe 10 minutes on your slow machine. All right, took a little while. Yeah, we're still waiting for Visual Studio to pop up, and there it is. Now, take a step back, because I remember one of the first times I worked with anything MVC, and I saw the extent of what it created automatically. I was a little blown away. And I don't know if you guys got that feeling when you tried it at home, or if you're trying it as you're watching this video, but it is pretty significant. Take a look really quickly at all the folders that are present. No, I don't want to do an update right now. And thank you for the tip. All right, so let's take a look at all the folders it created. So we have app data. We've seen that before, right? At the end of ASP.NET 1, where we were working with databases and things. There's an app start folder, a content folder, controllers, fonts, models, scripts, views, and a bunch of stuff already in the root. If I start expanding some of these, I'm like, oh my God, there's like all these folders already inside here. And oh my God, there's a gazillion pages already created. And it's okay to have that kind of a reaction too. Notice very interestingly the file extensions on the names, right? And this is kind of a new thing on some of this, right? These are not necessarily ASPX files in many cases. Often they're going to be these CSHTML. Anybody want to take a stab at what that means? What is C? Yeah, C#, right? And you know what? It doesn't hurt to just like, I don't know, let's take a look at the login page here. Yep, I wrote all that. Yep, that was me. No, not at all. Not one bit of it. That was those checkboxes for us. And you know, if you start digging into these folders, there is not a small amount of stuff that's been added for you. Some of it might look familiar, some of it might not. Looking in the scripts folder, oh my God, jQuery's already there, the modernizer's already there, you got Bootstrap, you got the min versions, the max versions, the IntelliSense, oh my God. You know, look at all those resources just added to your project. Models folder, okay, interesting. They seem like they're all related to the account creation. You know why? Because they are. There's a fonts folder. The controllers, yes, there's controllers in there already. Those are C# files. Content, which is a very interesting place to put your CSS. And one thing you should notice is that Bootstrap is CSS, but it's also JavaScript as well. It's the two things working together that make it happen. That's what makes it truly responsive. Then we have our app start folder. Oh my God, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there too. And here's the scary part of this, folks. There's still assets here that we're not even seeing. All the binaries that get created when you start to compile the code. Projects like this can easily reach like 100 megabytes. Easily. All you have to do is add a little content, a few pages, a few scripts, and a couple of plugins, and you got like this blossoming kind of thing going on. What I am going to do here is I am going to go ahead and launch this application. I'm going to close that particular thing, and I'm going to go ahead and launch this. I do want to make note, for most of you, this isn't going to be an issue to run this. On occasion, I get some crafty students that hack into Windows, and it's not really hacking, are clever enough to know how to turn on the internal web server for Windows. Do you guys know how to do that? Okay, and most people aren't even aware yet. All versions of Windows from XP on up, the professional versions in particular, have built in as an addable component Microsoft's web server software, which is called, by the way, Internet Information Services, or abbreviated IIS. And look at where my pointer is up on the screen there. This is Visual Studio's internal web server, just like we talked about the database, right? This is built into Visual Studio itself. Sometimes when you're doing this, if you are already running IIS as a full product, it can actually default to that, and it can cause some conflicts. For my money, unless you're really using your machine as a Windows web server, which I doubt, you should probably turn that product off and just use the internal one. That's my take on it. If you're not aware of the fact that Windows can even do that, you should try it sometime, because it's built in, right? So it allows you to actually take these ASP.NET applications that we build in this class and actually deploy them to a real web server. The reason that's kind of a difficult thing in general is because you have to be admin of the Windows machine in order to turn the app that you build into an actual application that is compiled on the server. If you do commercial hosting for ASP.NET, you get a control panel, like you do for Linux-based hosting, that is designed for Windows that allows you to do those same functions, basically on the back end. All right. I'm going to go ahead and hit the button. Let's take a look at what happens. And I promise as soon as we're done with this, we're taking a break. All right. It's going to take a few seconds, and you can see it, the output window is up, and it's doing a build, so it's actually compiling all the C# code that's in the application. It's getting it to run, and now it's launching it inside of Chrome, and thankfully it came up on this screen and not the other screen, which seems to happen to me often in these classrooms. And on first load, it will take a little while. As it's loading, please take notice of the address bar. If you have worked with like PHP, for example, and installed local server software like XAMPP or a WAMP or MAMP or whatever, any of those products, IIS Express is kind of an equivalent to that. The beauty of it, because it's inside of Visual Studio, there is no configuration you have to do. The port address it selects, and in this case it's port 44380, is selected randomly at the beginning of each session. It finds an open port way up in the range somewhere that nothing's using, and it uses that port. If your machine is addressable through that port, people on your network can actually pull up your application. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But you have to know the IP address of the machine and the port number. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit. You guys noticing how long this is taking to load? Yeah, this is taking a long time too, because when I click that button, it's not going to take quite as long as it did to build the whole thing, but it is taking all that code, the server side code, and converting it. It's actually compiling it on the server side in the temporary server and building it. All right. This is kind of zoomed in right now, but notice how it looks very much like what was in our book. So this is at 100% on what is it, a 1900 by 1080 or 1920 by 1080 screen. And notice kind of like just the whole simplistic beauty of it. It looks very clean because it's bootstrap. What I recommend that you do whenever you're doing something like this that's auto-generated, I mean, I'm curious. I want to see the source. So I'm going in and I'm checking the source. You can see, you know, the page structure doesn't have anything really cryptic in it or anything like that. It looks like a very clean HTML structure. There are a couple of things that look a little unusual, like data toggle collapse. Let's see, there's classes in here like navbar header, and I'm trying to find the real fun one here. Ooh, look at this class. Jumbotron. That's like a big feature of Bootstrap. And this little big thing at the top of the page, that's the Jumbotron. I didn't come up with it, folks. Somebody else did, but you know, hey, fair enough. Looks nice. And now let's actually go through and take a look at what it created for us. There's the home page. Well, I assume that this is the home page. You know what? It is. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and click on the About page. I want you to take a look, not only that, well, hey, thank you for pre-building my About page. Now all I have to do is put my stuff in there, right? But more importantly, take a look at the URL.
Folder structure.
Yeah, no. That's what we would assume. That's the folder structure. In actuality, what it is, we are going, the first part of this, which you will learn shortly, this is the controller that received your page request. Inside that controller, there was a method called About that generated this page. The first one is a call to the thing that's routing your traffic, basically, and the second one is a method call. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, it's kind of bizarre, actually. Click on contact, the same kind of thing happens. And isn't it nice? You know, they figured people are going to have a home page, people are going to have an about page, people are going to have a contact page. You probably want a copyright thing and a couple of things. All you do is type your stuff in, and you're like halfway there, right? So if you turn in your final project and it looks like this, I won't be all too happy because you didn't do anything, basically. Just a tip. But let's go ahead and actually click on these other two, which we mysteriously added with a couple of clicks. So I'm going to click on the register button, and I want you to notice really quickly, well, isn't that pretty, right? That looks really nice. You know, in fact, why don't I go ahead, you know, I'm going to log in with my school email. And I'm going to create a, yeah, and notice, did I code that? Use a suggested password?
I'm assuming it's a random password, people don't get the same one.
Yeah, and, well, and one step further than that, it's also a strong password.
Right.
So,
Password that needs the strong password parameters or whatever.
yeah, and that's kind of all built in too. So I'm going to do something that's a big no-no, which is to use a very weak password. Namely, I'm putting in the password, all lowercase, right? That's supposedly like the most used password. It's all coded in, folks. Must have at least one non-letter or digit character, so I need a special symbol in there. Passwords must have at least one digit, 0 through 9, and one uppercase. One special, one number, one upper. So I'm going to use the same password we use in SharePoint. My SharePoint people know what I'm talking about. And then I am going to register. By virtue of registration, I should have my account created. Triggers all like the normal stuff that you see in your browser. I'm not going to worry about saving it right now, but I'm also not going to say never. And notice, hey, I'm logged in. How beautiful is that? Let's click on that and let's see what that brings up. It's got an account management page already created too. You guys starting to see the power of this and what it really kind of brings to us? And it has the ability to change your password and to allow for external logins. If you are interested in doing two-factor authentication, they have plugins for that too. You want to annoy people on their cell phones? Go for it. Times that's actually been pretty helpful for me. I'm going to go ahead and log off, and then I'm going to come back and log in and see if I can. First I'm going to type the wrong password, just to show you that it works. Then I'm going to type the right password, and here I am. And notice I am logged in because it recognizes me. So that's pretty huge, I think, in terms of being able to really ramp up an application quickly. All right, that is basically the crux of what we do here. Now, if you were like, you know, just following the PDF, you know, they might tell you, all right, here's what you built, do this, and that, and then they start to talk about what's in the folders. And I know a lot of you might read this and some of you might not, but it is important, and you will be tested on what goes into some of the key folders. The three most important folders in my mind are the three first ones listed. You know, the MVC of the MVC, you know, models, views, and controllers. Now, notice just real briefly what it says here. Controllers folder is where you put controller classes that handle URL requests. So those are the files that receive the incoming requests from the client and then figure out what they're going to do with them. That's really as simple as that. Models is where you put files that basically describe your data structures, and in some cases manipulate those data structures, or sometimes just read them, or sometimes just create them. It just kind of depends on what you're doing. Sometimes models are directly related to database construct and sometimes not. I think the well-designed ones typically always are, but that's not always a necessity, frankly. The views folder is the part that generates what people see on the screen. Basically, it's as simple as that. Sometimes there's logic involved with that. And there are other pieces that will get dropped in that maybe don't fit particularly into any one of those folders, but it's really a good idea to kind of familiarize yourself with this architecture. All right, so they talk about the two controllers that we have. When we were hitting those pages and the URL said home/about, that was all being generated by this one file, the home controller. All the account stuff, and you know what? We didn't even look at the account URL when we were clicking on it, did we? We didn't even think about it, right? And that's how people use web applications. Nobody looks at the address bar anymore. My Web 1 students look at the address bar, or should, right? And notice how they're doing exactly the same thing that I was doing, kind of showing you all the folders, what's inside them. All right. Now remember, we had these like kind of rules, not rules, and that's not the right word, things that are common, or principles of MVC. You guys remember that? It's kind of an open source concept. And this whole thought of conventions. And the very last little phrase on this page, convention over configuration. So, Bootstrap is a convention, let's just use it. jQuery is a convention, let's just use it. Logging in, logging out, registering, secure passwords is a convention, let's just use it. I'm not configuring, all I'm configuring is a checkbox. Making a selection, hitting a button, and it's there. That's the power here. And it's a really good example of that. Now, I didn't go ahead and add unit tests, did I? Did I skip that part? Oops. All right, you guys better not, because I'll downgrade you if you do. But unit tests, if you click the box, and I'm sorry that I missed it, will create a whole separate set of folders. And all of this stuff, remember, the intent of it is to be able to test all the code in the top section. And that's really kind of a whole separate field of study. And there are programmers whose whole career is just doing that. Writing code to test code. And unit testing is kind of a big thing. I went to a conference, we have these state-called meetings for the technical college system, where all the IT people get together. We do that once a year. And one of the instructors at, I think it was like Mid-State Technical College and maybe like Wisconsin Rapids or Stevens Point or something, he got like some special like grant or something to write a C# course. And what he did, he got a whole semester to do it, to do one project. And he wrote a C# programming course in this environment. And he also pre-created a whole set of assignments. So students would like create this, build that, attach it to the database, take these steps, and then create a method that does this. And then he wrote unit tests that automatically graded the entire course. And I was like, oh my God, that is really impressive. And I would never do that for you guys, just so you know. You know why? Because this is going to change next year and I'd have to rewrite the whole thing. But I think it's pretty impressive because that's one of the types of things that you can do. Right? All right. Convention over configuration. We know by now how to build a web application. Let's roll that experience into the framework so we don't have to configure absolutely everything again. Okay. Simple as that. Make sure you read these little summaries and stuff. That wraps the chapter, folks. And I'm going to end this video. take a break, come back with you more.